I think let's go with Kenneth. Kenneth, who's calling in from Georgia. Kenneth, you are live on Talk Heathen. What's up?
Hey, what's up?
What's going on, Kenneth? We're just having a good time in the studio. How can we help?
Nothing much. Just I don't know what the call screener wrote in, but I basically said that I have some things in ancient history that I think kind of point to some biblical truths, but kind of alongside that, I also think that a lot of Christians interpret the Bible through a wrong lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're talking about does the Bible describe some historical events or relate to things in history, yeah, I agree with that. There's definitely some instances, but I don't know if I'd say all of the Bible does. So, what are you thinking of in particular?
Specifically, some of the myths.
Okay.
Specifically the Great Flood.
Okay.
So there have been a lot, pretty much in every ancient myth across the world, there's been a Great Flood. Mm-hmm. That's just one example. There's sea things inside of mountains. Yes. I don't know the specifics, but just basically things that just kind of point me to the direction of I hear a lot of people, apologists will say that I believe everything in it. And if something's not true, then it's all wrong. Well, I don't necessarily believe that.
Yeah. So I agree with you in that it's interesting when you study historic, world cultures, there are a lot of flood myths. That's actually a very common trope in ancient literature. There's representations of what the flood means that seem to have symbolic meaning that's also shared within the Christian texts. So, and the Jewish texts in particular. But yeah, there's definitely some similarities there. It also floods a lot in a lot of places, right? If you also notice, there's a lot of places, especially in the East, where there's dragon myths. There's a lot of dragon myths out there. And that doesn't necessarily mean that dragons were ever a thing. Now, maybe you actually think that it does, and some people will go that route. But, just because we see some similarities in some of these stories doesn't necessarily mean they're talking to a particular truth. And one thing, too, is, the details are always going to be different. In these other flood myths, they're not talking about a guy who talked to God and brought an ark and all the animals on a boat. They're just talking about a big flood happened and another god was angry. Or, there's other kinds of stories. So there's big differences, right?
Yeah, there really are. And, it's important for usually human societies to have access to water. People need that. So, living near water would make it likely that you may experience a flood event.
If you live in an ancient agricultural society, a flood is a very big deal for you, right? It's a significant event, and it's something that you could tell about through future generations through stories, right? And that can turn into some of the myths. And I think that's the best explanation for what we see. I don't know if it necessarily points to the truth, because think about this too, right, Kenneth? Why do we privilege the Christian? Well, hold on, Kenneth, just real quick, because why would you privilege the Christian perspective on this, and why not other cultures' perspective on the flood? In other words, the Christian narrative has a very particular story to it, but other cultures have other stories to it. Why does the Christian one have a privileged perspective on that?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but specifically, all these myths are pointing to a world flood event, not just a big flood, but a world flood event.
Yeah,
and the reason that Christianity takes privilege, or the reason that I would give is the flood is just a specific example, but there are also a lot of other things like Israel becoming a state, and blah blah blah. But they're just other little things. But that's just one example.
Yeah.
The other thing about the flood myths, too, is there are some myths that describe a global flood. There are also a lot of myths that describe just a large regional flood or a flood that affected, everything in the known area, which kind of brings up another point. If you're living in an ancient society and there's a large flood, how do you know whether it was global or not?
Yeah.
I mean, it's
if
hyperbolic.
if waters came in through Austin, right, and I'm living like several thousand years ago, how do I know that it went around the whole world?
Right. I mean, they didn't have, like the satellite imagery to say, the weather person wasn't there, tracking this global flood.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times in some of these writings, it's a writing style to speak in kind of hyperbolic ways sometimes. And, like when they're describing lengths of time and things like that in the Bible, a lot of times you see this like repetition of this 40 days or 40 nights, as kind of a
particular religious numbers that show up time and time again. And also there's more than one kind of flood story too, but that's in the Bible itself. I'm not talking about worldwide. I'm talking about there's kind of multiple flood narratives within the text of Genesis, but that's another topic.
Yeah. But this.
Yeah, well.
No, go ahead.
Basically, so Noah and the ark, and basically when I say that most Christians don't interpret the Bible right, and when the Bible says that Noah gathered all the animals and there's a big flood and everybody died, like, I don't think that that's necessarily true.
Okay.
Just like I don't think that Samson literally took the jawbone of a donkey and killed 50,000, it said. I don't think that actually happened. Maybe something to that degree. I'm not saying it wasn't exaggerated, but a lot of ancient texts are exaggerated.
Sure.
Not to say that some elements aren't true.
So,
because there's dimensions of the ark, specific dimensions.
Okay, but like Star Trek has dimensions of ships too, right? Like of starships. Like that doesn't mean that that's any more real.
Oh,
right?
You had that compendium.
But I'm saying that he built the ark.
Right, but
put animals in it, and he maybe thought that was all the animals in the world at the time. In that region of the world, he gathered all the animals in that region of the world and built this ark.
Well, then wouldn't the global?
He thought that it killed everybody.
Right, but if it was a global flood, then it would have killed all the animals on Earth, unless you don't think it was a global flood.
No, I don't think. I think. It was a global flood.
Okay,
but
so if you only got,
because
wait, isn't that a problem though? Because sorry, Kenneth, I don't mean to interrupt, but isn't that a problem?
No,
if you're saying it's just he got the local animals, but he did a global flood, then we'd only have the animals around the Middle East, right? Like we wouldn't have animals in Australia or kangaroo, all these places.
Penguins
right?
and stuff were probably not there.
Okay.
Right.
So a lot of archaeologists would disagree with what I'm saying, but I propose, with a lot of other, secular, well, they're not secular, but they're kind of a sect away from regular archaeologists like Graham Hancock.
Yes.
What they kind of propose is that humans have been through, multiple extinction events. And this is one of those events that I'm proposing that could lead to the Bible. I'm not saying that Graham Hancock, this guy, believes what I believe, but I am proposing what they propose that a lot of archaeologists disagree with.
Yeah, I think if we had evidence of a global flood, that would be something to look at. But unfortunately, outside of the stories, we really don't. There are people who are
there is evidence
of a global flood.
But like I said, there is evidence of a global flood. But you can hear these guys talk about it, but I'm not professionally inclined to talk about it. But a lot, it's known that a lot of the archaeologist community disagrees or dismisses, it's a known thing. And it's something, because science is all about disagreeing. Science is all about disagreement within the field. And if a certain group kind of dismisses another group, that's not really fair.
Well, why do you think it is then that the majority of the scientists who are working in the field of archaeology dismiss this claim? Are you saying that they're dismissing it out of hand when in fact it is a valid argument? Or are you saying that it doesn't hold up to the standards that other scientific publications would be held to?
I'm saying that what I've seen, again, I'm not professionally inclined, but from what I've seen, I think that they would be dismissing it because it disproves what they've already said.
So why would that be the case? That kind of makes it sound like there's some sort of big conspiracy among the scientific community that they've decided that they want to believe that something is true and are essentially engaging in this grand conspiracy where they're, I guess, inventing data and submitting all of these publications that they know to be false, and not a single one has broken ranks to bring all this to light and say, hey, I've been a part of this scientific community for all these years, and guess what? It's all a sham. They're all, submitting these false.
Yeah, there have been some people. There have been multiple people that they just, like I've named a few, like Graham Hancock. There's another guy.
Yeah.
But there's multiple people that have broken off. I mean, they just don't have a loud voice, obviously.
Sure.
They're not the majority, they're the minority.
To be fair, though, Kenneth, there's also multiple scientific fields that dispute this claim. I mean, we're not just talking about archaeology. If there was a global flood...
And there's been conspiracies...
I mean...
There's been conspiracies in the scientific field forever, just like there has been in government. I mean, to say there hasn't been conspiracies is, I mean, come on now.
I agree conspiracies happen, but Kenneth, we have to have a reason why to believe a conspiracy. I mean, think about this, Kenneth. For the vast majority of European history and the Western tradition in general, a lot of people have been Christian. Christian has been one of the most dominant religions on earth. And in fact, a lot of people who got into the field of archaeology want to specifically prove specific things in the Bible. Like, that's a very motivating force. The fact that we don't even have that consensus, I think, is telling of something. I think it's saying, look, we've reviewed things, we've searched things out. There doesn't seem to be any particular evidence to support that claim. And that's not what we want to do. We don't want to reconstruct the narrative that a text presents. We want to see, okay, what does the evidence tell us first? And then we get the story from that. The fact is, the Namib, for example, is a desert that's at least 55 million years old. You can't have a desert that's 55 million years old if it's got a flood as part of its history, right? Like, there's just lots of things that don't add up. It's not even just archaeology. It's just, it would completely change the way that we understand natural sciences if that was true.
Yeah, and I want to follow up, too, just, kind of going back to what we were saying about, these people such as Graham Hancock.
Yeah.
That is not someone who is a scholar who then broke ranks with the field of archaeology to say, oh, in fact, everything was false. He's someone who writes popular books for a popular audience. He doesn't write scholarly articles or books or anything that's peer-reviewed. These are popular books that sell really well because... it's interesting, it's fun, it's like watching Ancient Aliens, on TV. Spoiler alert, that's not real.
I just gave Graham Hancock as an example. There are other archaeologists. This guy, I don't know his name specifically, but he's been to Israel and uncovered some things. And
okay, well, I hear you talking about other people's work.
The evidence is here.
Well, okay, can you give us one specific example of this evidence? Because I hear you saying that they talk about it, but what are they talking about? Can you give us just one?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so they propose that, so Graham Hancock, first of all, is not trying to prove the biblical evidence or anything. He's trying to prove ancient civilizations that were advanced, we survived these extinction events and we were more advanced before then. That's what he's trying to prove.
Okay.
And I'm saying that leads into it biblically. That's not what he's saying.
Oh,
maybe he was a bad example to you.
I mean, that's fine. But again, I want to know what evidence, what is he talking about? Why should I believe that there was ever a global flood?
I don't know offhand, but he talks about, up in these mountains, there are, oceanic artifacts, like sea fossils up in these mountains.
Yes.
That shouldn't be there.
And that's true.
And just like I said, ancient people just talking about a flood from all across the world that they had never met. The Mayans in North America, the Egyptians in Africa.
Sure. Okay.
But we have floods everywhere. It's not revealing of anything to say that people who live near water all over the world talk about experiencing floods. We know that floods happen. That's not any kind of spectacular news. the extraordinary claim would be that a global flood happened all at once. And as we kind of mentioned earlier, I'm not sure how that would even be documented if that were to have occurred. The fact that different civilizations talk about having floods doesn't really demonstrate that. So I don't think that does much to demonstrate that there was a global flood, just that there are floods sometimes, and that's not in dispute.
Yeah. Also, Kenneth, when we're talking about sea fossils found in high up mountains, that actually fits pretty well with an old Earth model. You can find bones of whales on top of Mount Everest, for example, at least what I've been told, because the world looked a lot different back then. I'm sure you're familiar with Pangea and the way that continents kind of drift apart and come together in different ways because of these natural processes.
There are scientists that disagree with that.
There are scientists that disagree with it. There's also a lot more. Kenneth, if you want me to tell you the scientific consensus, I can tell you the scientific consensus, and that is the majority of scientists believe that the Earth is old and that the Earth has been changing through natural processes. And through those natural processes, we find things like sea creature fossils on top of mountains because where that mountain was used to be underwater. I mean, that makes sense in an old Earth model if you believe in slow changes over time. It actually doesn't make sense if you're talking about a global flood. Like a global flood event would be one thing that happens in 40 days, right? At least as the popular Bible account is. The fact is we find different animals from completely different time periods in these different places, right? If it was a global flood event, we would assume that all of these animals would have to exist at the same time if we're going to be using that as evidence. But the evidence doesn't tell us that these animals existed at the same time. In most cases, they existed millions of years apart. So, I think we got to keep going because we got some other folks that need to talk to us, Kenneth. But what I want to leave you with is I'm hearing a lot of...
Last point. All right. Well, what I would have to say, my last point would be that scientists like consensus has been disproven. And just because it's the main one out, things have been disproven. And just because the voice isn't loud doesn't mean it's not true.
And you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right about that. But you also have to know why. There are reasons why a scientific consensus becomes true. The scientific consensus on this issue is not going to suddenly not be true because a bunch of different cultures talked about a flood story. And I think that's pretty much the only thing I've heard so far. I haven't heard anything about the geological record. I haven't heard anything about seismic processes. I mean, there's other things that we should be able to point to outside of human accounts for a global flood event to have occurred. And that's what I'm not seeing. That's what the scientific community at large isn't seeing. There are some people who see it, and to be honest, they have a lot of motivated reasoning. I mean, there's a reason why these people are Christian, and they go out and do these digs and want to figure this stuff out. The pseudo-archaeology community is a thing, but I don't think that we're ever going to find evidence of a global flood because I just don't think it happened. And if we did, it has to be more than just stories people have told. I don't think that's strong enough evidence.
Well, and also to kind of follow up on that too, like you mentioned, yes, it is true that sometimes there can be consensus on some topic and then later more information comes out or there's a new way of investigating and we learn something new and we say, oh, you know what, that wasn't exactly right. Actually, here's new information. And we see that happen all the time. And that happens consistently. In fact, I'm going to get a book recommendation in here. Thomas Kuhn wrote a book. It's one of the most cited academic books ever, I think, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he talks about this concept of a paradigm shift, which is kind of one of the instances where you might say that the scientific consensus on something might change or, dare I say, shift. And the way he describes that process happening is that it becomes apparent over time that, yes, there has been argument and dissent within the scientific community about a topic, and it becomes clear that the existing model does not adequately explain whatever this phenomenon is. And the reason it ends up shifting is because people begin to realize there's a problem with this model. Here are all these ways that it is inadequate or inaccurate or it's not answering something. And so then they figure out there's a problem here. Let's look at this a different way. They realize what, correction might need to be made and then continue moving on. And there's maybe a new, quote unquote, consensus I don't know why I put that in air quotes. Sorry. There's a new consensus that is then reached.
Right.
And people continue on. And it's not usually something in the case I'm describing that would just result from, well, there were some people that were motivated for there to be a different answer. It was that the model was inadequate in various ways. And then it is adjusted to more accurately capture, what this phenomenon is, what we're seeing in the world. Like
because we find new evidence supports that view, and we have not found new evidence that supports global flood, as far as I am aware. Okay, I'm not an archaeologist or anything of the sort, but that's my take on that. But Kenneth, thanks so much for calling. I hope that was a productive conversation for you. And we're going to get some more callers, but we have a super chat I got to read out. It comes from Dark Moon Wyndham, who gave $5. Thank you so much for that. And they said, a global flood is mathematically impossible. It would take 4.56 times 10 to the power of 9, I think that's kilometers squared, to flood the planet. That amount of water does not exist on Earth. And they're right. It doesn't exist on Earth. Now, there are some people that say that the water is underground. And there is actually evidence of underground oceans, if you look at that, which is fascinating. Another thing that young Earth creationists will tout is that if they believe in a flat Earth model, that the water is above the firmament and has been up there this whole time.
I've heard that one.
Yeah,
I have heard that one before.
So there may be ways to get around that. I'm just saying. Just saying, could be there. But again, I just don't think there's good enough real reasons to think about it.
I am not convinced of that model over the existing one.
Yeah, I'm not either. At this time, I'm not either.
But I'm open to changing my mind.
Right. I am too. And I'd be happy to talk to some more people about that kind of stuff.